Lord of Mysteries. My Identities Echoes Across Time. Chapter 101 to 110. Although there is only a slight wavering at the moment, it indicates an opportunity. With persistent effort, the Death Consul might eventually evolve into Isaac earlier. At that time, I could recruit him from the God of Death, potentially adding an angel-level member to my Eye of Secrets. In the fifth epic, Lynn, multitasking as usual, was grooming himself in front of a mirror. His first Smurf account continued assisting Saucerier with official duties, while his secondary Smurf account stayed at the banquet, observing the lively scene. As for the Death Consul Isaac, after being swayed by Lynn's words, he ultimately made a hasty retreat. Lynn didn't mind this, as he could see that Isaac was already somewhat shaken, which was enough for now. Lynn had never planned to change Isaac's mind with just one conversation. Such matters take time. Yes, after the banquet ends, I have arranged for Mr. Door to schedule another talk with Isaac. I can further probe then. Should I spoil a bit of the future to him? That could be interesting. Thinking this, Lynn adjusted his golden curls in the mirror. Looking at his incredibly handsome reflection, he smiled and then, taking his pen and notebook, headed to 15 Minsk Street. He began to ring the bell in front of Klein's house. "Sherlock, are you ready? We need to visit the next school." Lynn cheerfully shook the bell and called out, despite being busy with Isaac-related matters in the fourth epic. In the fifth epic, his primary task was to learn how to be a good teacher. Thankfully, Lynn had grown accustomed to multitasking, handling everything without issue. Soon, the door opened, and Klein appeared. To Lynn's slight surprise, Klein had not changed into outdoor clothes but was still wearing his usual home attire. Lynn raised an eyebrow, already suspecting the reason, and asked, "Are you not planning to be my assistant anymore?" "It's not that," Klein shook his head. "Mr. Isaac, my teacher, has replied. He will likely arrive this morning, so if you want to meet him, we might need to cancel our morning plans." "Just as I thought." Lynn wasn't surprised but feigned delight. "Really? That's great. Come in. You can wait in the living room. Mr. Isaac should be here soon." Klein stepped aside, gesturing for Lynn to enter. Lynn, not being a stranger, found a familiar spot on the sofa and sat down. Seeing Klein about to make tea, he said, "I'd like coffee today, very strong, please." "No sugar." Klein gestured to the sugar jar and asked. "No sugar, but you can add milk." Lynn thought for a moment and said, "No problem." Klein nodded, expertly making coffee for both. Handing the strong cup to Lynn, he sat opposite him, picked up the day's newspaper, and handed half to Lynn before starting to read. After a few minutes, the doorbell rang. Klein put down the newspaper, stood up, and walked to the door. Before opening it, his instincts as a clown told him who the visitors were. Outside stood two women, not Mr. Isaac as Klein had expected. One was his landlady, Mrs. Sammer, who was dressed quite formally with elaborate makeup, and the other was an unfamiliar woman wearing a wide-brimmed hat with a veil and dark-colored attire. Why is Mrs. Sammer here, and who is this woman? Is it a commission? Ads by PubFuture. Klein wondered but opened the door, greeting the two ladies. "Sherlock Moriarty, my friend needs your help," Mrs. Sammer said directly, unusually serious. Then she noticed Lynn behind Klein. "And you are?" "Hello, I'm just a friend of Sherlock." Lynn smiled and greeted Mrs. Sammer. He wasn't surprised she didn't recognize him, as he wasn't universally known despite his minor fame in Backland. As he greeted them, Lynn recalled the plot involving Mrs. Sammer and the woman beside her. If he remembered correctly, this was Mary Gale, a woman betrayed by her husband. In the original story, her commission was crucial as it led Klein to join the Quelaag Club. Through this club, Klein met Dr. Aaron, who would become the father of the Snake of Mercurywool, and horse-riding coach Talum, who had ties to Triss, the vessel for the primordial demoness. This series of events eventually dragged Klein into the Backland Fog incident. Even later, when Klein reappeared as Dwayne Dantes, Mary Gale still had a role, making her an important minor character in the storyline. "I recall they came to commission him on a Tuesday. Is this a butterfly effect because I took Klein to school early yesterday?" Lynn mused, feeling a bit guilty. Although he remembered all the plot details about Mary Gale, this situation hadn't crossed his mind due to his recent busyness. However, Klein's circumstances meant that even if he missed this commission, he would eventually join the Quelaag Club for other reasons. So, there wasn't much to worry about. With this in mind, Lynn's fleeting guilt disappeared. He then said, "You seem to have a commission for Sherlock. I'll leave you to it." Lynn winked at Klein and swiftly retreated to 16 Minsk Street, deciding not to get involved in Klein's marital investigation commission as he had his pride. However, Lynn pondered, standing by the window and watching the scene unfold. Should I reach out to this snake of Mercury? It feels like it could be interesting. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Klein naturally didn't know what Mary Gale's commission would bring him. After witnessing Lynn's quick escape, he welcomed the two ladies into the living room. After hearing the story of Mary Gale's unfortunate encounter, Klein pondered for a moment before accepting Mary Gale's commission to catch her unfaithful husband. After sending off the two ladies, Klein looked at Lynn, who arrived and had resumed drinking coffee and reading the newspaper on the sofa. Klein couldn't help but say, "I thought you would reveal your identity. Mrs. Sammer would likely have given the commission to you." Lynn Sotos had a much more prominent reputation in the industry compared to Klein's alias, Sherlock. Even if Mrs. Sammer hadn't met Lynn before, she likely had heard his name. "Don't think so poorly of me. How could I steal your commission?" Lynn took a sip of coffee and righteously responded. "Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't. But given that I just offended you recently," Klein joked. Suddenly, he sensed something and looked in a certain direction. The room was filled with vibrant colors, and then a figure appeared in the center of the living room. The person had bronze skin, soft features, and eyes that seemed to hold an indescribable sense of age. It was Isaac Eggers. "Good morning, Klein." Mr. Isaac greeted Klein with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Isaac." Klein replied politely. He then stood up and introduced Lynn to Isaac. "This is Lynn Sotos, the person I mentioned in my letter yesterday." "Hello." Lynn stood up while observing Isaac. Unlike the death consul he had recently seen in the fourth epic, the current Isaac looked like a gentle elder, devoid of any sternness, making it hard to believe they were the same person. So, this is father figure Isaac, just as described in the original novel. Lynn thought, while also experiencing a vision. Expecting this, Lynn remained calm and silently received the information from the aftermath. The information wasn't extensive, but it, combined with previous insights, gave Lynn a better understanding of Isaac's current situation. But it's still not enough. "I need more information," Lynn thought while maintaining a calm facade. Isaac's gaze also fell on Lynn. His expression momentarily seemed confused before he spoke. "I've seen you before." Mr. Isaac really has seen Lynn. Does this mean Lynn is the reincarnation of some high-sequence big shot? Klein immediately perked up, his eyes darting between the two. "But I don't remember seeing you." Lynn, instantly embodying a dramatic persona, pursed his lips and showed a complex expression, part shock, part rejection, and part confusion, perfectly portraying someone in denial about their lost memories. "Mr. Isaac, Lynn has also lost his past memories, and it seems his loss is even more thorough than yours." Klein timely reminded, then curiously asked, "Mr. Isaac, how much do you remember about Lynn?" "Not much. I only just recalled our first meeting," Isaac said, looking at Lynn with a nuanced expression, mixed with a sigh. He said, "Libert Abraham, long time no see. I didn't expect that we'd meet again in such a state." Isaac indeed remembered the person in front of him. He recalled their encounter when he was the death consul and the banquet they attended together. Although he still didn't fully understand his past life, the words the young angel had spoken to him at that banquet had deeply resonated with him. He wasn't sure what kind of person he had been, but he could tell from scattered memories that his past self might have been vastly different from his current self. Perhaps a cold person, someone he could hardly imagine now. Yet, in those ancient memories, the young angel before him seemed to have seen through his essence, accurately predicting his future. "Libert Abraham." Lynn showed a puzzled expression. He looked at Isaac and hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "Are you talking to me?" While acting dramatically, Lynn also sighed in relief. He had figured out Isaac's situation. Isaac had indeed remembered him but had not realized the past had been altered, treating the memory as a normal part of his history. This made things easier for Lynn, saving him a lot of trouble. Of course, Lynn had considered a contingency plan if Isaac, like Medici, realized the past had been changed. In such a case, confession was not an option. After all, Isaac was not Medici. Lynn confessed to Medici because they were like brothers with a close bond, and Medici, as the god of war, was particularly difficult to deceive. Hence, Lynn chose to be upfront to gain more leverage. But Isaac didn't get that treatment. They were not close, and confessing to Isaac would be social suicide with the fool. So, from the start, Lynn decided that if Isaac realized the past had been altered, he would play dumb. Don't ask. If you ask, it's all the work of angelic personas. He was just a weak, pitiful, helpless amnesiac. As long as Lynn shifted the blame quickly enough, his true identity wouldn't be revealed. Of course, this plan included other details to enhance credibility. But since Isaac hadn't noticed the alteration, Lynn just needed to maintain his amnesiac high-ranking persona. As for whether Isaac might realize it in the future, they would cross that bridge when they came to it. Upon hearing the name Isaac mentioned, Klein's mind was filled with information about the Abraham family. Abraham, the family from the Fourth Epic's Tudor Empire. Could Lynn be a member of the Abraham family? End of chapter. Lynn isn't from the apprentice pathway, but the Abraham family is known to control the apprentice pathway. This doesn't mean that every member of the family must follow that path. Klein pondered this as he looked at Isaac, intrigued. Although prying into someone's privacy wasn't right, his curiosity about Lynn's past, especially considering Lynn's connection to his angelic transmigrator, was overwhelming. It seems you've indeed forgotten more than I have, Isaac sighed, observing the expression on Lynn's face. Pausing briefly, he spoke in a gentle tone. I understand your reluctance to face your past. I share your fear of the unknown and feel estranged from my former self. What do you know? Lynn asked after a few seconds of silence, as if summoning his resolve. My knowledge of you is limited. I've only recalled a fragment of memory concerning you, Isaac explained, looking at Lynn. I remember that you are the only offspring of Mr. Dorr, highly regarded by him. You were also the knowledge magister of the Savon pathway, a sequence 2. Klein was stunned. Lynn turned out to be the child of Mr. Dorr from Russell's diary. And a sequence 2 knowledge magister. Even though he had suspected Lynn was a formidable individual, Klein never imagined he would be an angel, and a child of the mysterious Mr. Dorr. But how did Lynn end up in this situation? After the initial shock, Klein couldn't help but wonder. Impossible, I'm merely a sequence 8, and I'm on the mystery prior pathway, Lynn responded, his expression one of disbelief. Besides, Mr. Dorr was exiled in the Fourth Epic. This can't be true. Lynn's words were firm, but his slightly shaken expression demonstrated his acting prowess. I don't know what has happened to you. In my memory, this is the truth, Isaac stated gently. Perhaps you need not fear your past. From what I recall, your personality hasn't changed much. In Isaac's memory, Libert Abraham was more mysterious, but the young angel felt very similar to the current young man, which made Isaac certain of Lynn's identity. Though the past death console was cold, Libert Abraham and Lynn were nearly identical in essence. It seemed time had only stripped the young angel of his memories without altering his core. Lynn displayed a suitably conflicted expression, appearing to grapple with doubt and hesitation. After several seconds, he asked, You're certain you haven't mistaken me for someone else? I am certain, Isaac affirmed seriously. Then it must be true, I must have truly lost my memory. That explains why he approached me and said those strange things, Lynn muttered. Then, taking a deep breath as if accepting the reality, he addressed Isaac. I will seek confirmation of this from others. Mr. Isaac, if you recall more about me, could you inform me? I'm willing to compensate you. No compensation is necessary. If I remember more, I will tell you. However, if you recover your memories and recall something about me, please do inform me as well, Isaac replied kindly. Agreed, Lynn forced a smile. As Russell would say, we're in the same boat, aren't we? Lynn, are you all right? Klein couldn't help but ask, his voice filled with concern. I'm fine, just very surprised, Lynn shook his head. Rubbing his face, he looked at Klein and said, Sorry, I might need some time alone. Klein opened his mouth, wanting to comfort Lynn but ultimately unsure of what to say. Thus, Klein could only ask, So, is today's commission cancelled? Attempting to divert the topic. Yes, it's cancelled. I apologize, I need to rest, Lynn replied, then turned to Isaac. Mr. Isaac, thank you for telling me all this. You're welcome, Isaac responded warmly. Rest well. He could completely understand Libert's feelings. When Isaac first started to recall his past, realizing he had a mysterious history, he was in a similarly poor state. Even now, Isaac feared his past. He dreaded becoming a stranger upon regaining his full memory, afraid of not recognizing himself. But despite this, I still want to reclaim my past, and you feel the same, don't you? Isaac thought silently, seeing that while Libert might resist and fear, once accepting the truth, he too would seek out his past. Lynn maintained his role, and after bidding farewell to both of them, quickly returned to 16 Minsk Street. Even back in his bedroom, he continued his immersive act. After all, details matter in acting, and Lynn was a professional. However, this part of the act didn't require much effort from Lynn. He put his main consciousness in a semi-automated state and shifted his primary focus to his alternate identity. With Isaac's confirmation, my main identity as an amnesiac angel is solidified. Later, I can reveal that Libert Abraham equals the Angel of Secrets, but that's for much later. I have no immediate plans for that. Lynn mused, swirling grape juice in his cup, satisfied with his recent performance. Acting was indeed enjoyable. With this connection, it'll be easier to approach Isaac to gather information and observe the impact of my fourth epic actions on him, essentially getting permission to observe the experiment sample up close. And having two versions of Isaac is definitely more fun. Lynn thought, glancing at the other side of the hall, where Death Consul Isaac was conversing with a noble. He already had plans for their next meeting. Spoiling the plot was too tempting. So it's decided. Isaac will know about his future amazing student, little Klein, without revealing specific details. End of chapter. For the Death Consul Isaac, today is probably the most extraordinary day since his birth. He replaced the Underworld Emperor in receiving two of the most significant King of Angels of this era, and saw the rumored offspring recently brought home by Mr. Dorr, and for the first time, felt shaken by the words of this young angel. Never having truly considered his own nature, the Death Consul Isaac couldn't suppress the urge to ponder his essence. Was he really the gentle, family-oriented person described by Libert Abraham? His rational side still told him that was impossible, yet the hint of humanity born from his followers and anchor points inevitably swayed him. Isaac had to admit that the version of himself described by Libert both terrified and confused him, but also attracted him slightly. In a sense, Libert Abraham is a truly frightening existence. After the banquet, in a secluded corner of the royal palace of the Balaam Empire, Isaac exhaled deeply, feeling the need for solitude. At least for tonight, he did not want to see that young angel again. Otherwise, he feared he might do something irrational due to the young angel's words. Let him stay alone here for a while, let him suppress that wavering again. Isaac thought, leaning against the wall, quietly gazing at the faintly visible stars in the sky. Prince Isaac, so you are here. A familiar voice sounded beside him. Isaac turned his head and saw a familiar figure, a servant of the Underworld Emperor. What's the matter? Isaac straightened up and looked at the servant, speaking lightly. Does His Majesty have something for me to handle? The servant respectfully said, it's like this, Prince Isaac. Prince Libert from the Tudor Empire seems to have some important matters related to both countries to discuss with you. He is waiting in meeting room No. 3. Isaac. To be honest, Isaac's first reaction was to refuse, but as the chief tool of the God of Death and the actual handler of various affairs in the Balaam Empire, his sense of responsibility as a consul made him nod. He said with some difficulty, let's go. The servant then respectfully led the way. Soon, they arrived at the familiar meeting room No. 3. After dismissing the servant, Isaac hesitated for a second before pushing the door open. Inside, unsurprisingly, was the young angel. Yo, Isaac, long time no see. Lynn greeted cheerfully, continuing to write and draw with his hands. Long time no see, Libert. I heard you have important matters related to both countries to discuss with me. Isaac closed the door, his tone formal and businesslike. He then paused, noticing a power enveloping the entire meeting room, a power of space and ceiling, abilities from the door pathway. This made Isaac vigilant almost instantly, though he did not become overly tense. After all, they were in the royal palace of the Balaam Empire. If something really happened, his father, the underworld emperor, would surely notice. Moreover, the power enveloping the room seemed more like a confidentiality measure than an attempt to trap him. Could Libert really have something important to discuss? Isaac thought instinctively, and then he saw the young man wave his hand, nonchalantly saying, "Don't worry, it's just for confidentiality. As for the so-called important matters related to both countries, that was just an excuse. I don't actually have anything related to both countries to discuss. I'm just here for fun. The important stuff is handled by Bethel and the others." Isaac. Somehow, he was not surprised at all. Isaac suddenly felt a headache. At this moment, he felt a kinship with Mr. Dorr, but his good manners kept him from cursing out loud. Isaac just couldn't help but rub his temples, speaking lightly, "If you have nothing to discuss, may I take my leave? I have other affairs to handle." This was not a mere excuse. As the consul of the Balaam Empire, there were plenty of things he needed to deal with. "No, you can't. This meeting was initiated by Bethel and approved by His Majesty, so no one is allowed to leave without my permission." Lynn smiled warmly and kindly, yet his words carried an undeniable authority. Isaac. In that instant, Isaac really wanted to ask Mr. Dorr, "Do you know that spoiling a child like this will spoil them rotten?" At the same time, Isaac inevitably thought of the treatment he usually received from the Underworld Emperor. Although the Underworld Emperor valued him highly as his most capable deputy, he would never treat Isaac the way Mr. Dorr treated Libert, like a father doting on his child. No, he shouldn't think like that. The Underworld Emperor's attitude was normal for a deity. Mr. Dorr's way was an exception. Isaac suppressed his subtle thoughts, hearing the young angel continue. "Moreover, although I have nothing related to both countries to discuss, I do have something important related to you, Isaac Eggers." Hearing the other seriously call his name, Isaac was stunned for a moment, unable to help asking, "Something related to me?" "Yes." Lynn nodded, finally stopping his drawing and writing, then handed over the freshly drawn picture to Isaac. Isaac, a bit puzzled, took the picture. It depicted two cats, one big and one small. The larger cat, seemingly a leopard cat, looked strong and fierce. But its action was to protect a small black kitten behind it. The black kitten had a small, exquisite silk hat on its head. End of chapter. The entire painting was of an exceptionally high standard. Even the death consul Isaac had to admit that the young angel before him was indeed quite skilled in the art of drawing. No wonder he had insisted on painting his portrait upon their first meeting. He genuinely seemed to love and excel in this field. But what did it mean? Death Consul scrutinized the picture in his hand, puzzled. He couldn't help but look at Lynn and ask, "Prince Libert, is the matter related to me that you mentioned referring to this painting?" Lynn didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leisurely wiped his fingers clean with a handkerchief, poured himself a cup of tea, and took a comfortable sip. Only then did he speak, adopting a very mystical tone. "This is your future, Isaac." Isaac felt that he had been rendered speechless far too many times today, but he couldn't help it. He stared almost incredulously at Lynn, then looked down at the painting in his hand. After a long moment, he said, "Prince Libert, this is not a funny joke. I am not joking with you. I just saw your future and recorded it truthfully, that's all." Lynn put down his tea and looked at Isaac, his expression no longer frivolous and relaxed but now carrying a touch of seriousness and gravity. At this moment, he no longer seemed like a carefree, dashing youth but more like a wise man who had seen through all of existence. Isaac's expression also grew more solemn, although due to his naturally stern demeanor, this added gravity wasn't overly apparent. "To my knowledge, you do not follow the Wheel of Fortune pathway." Isaac spoke, sensing that things might be going beyond his expectations. But just as in the banquet earlier, where he sensed danger but didn't move, his rationality was now telling him to leave, yet he didn't. "You're right, I do not follow the Wheel of Fortune pathway, but that doesn't contradict my ability to see the future, does it?" Lynn smiled at Isaac, speaking slowly. "I saw your soul no longer whole, split in two. I saw you trapped in endless cycles of reincarnation, repeatedly losing your memory and searching again and again. I saw you having the family you yearned for in these cycles, only to inevitably lose them. I saw that at the end of your journey, where you were supposed to lose yourself entirely, you met someone who changed your fate. That person was your student, your anchor, through whom you avoided destruction and gained the chance to choose. I saw you finally choosing humanity, abandoning divinity. Isaac almost instinctively clenched the painting in his hand but relaxed his grip before he could tear it. It was hard to say what was going through his mind at that moment. After a long pause, Lynn heard Isaac's somewhat dry voice, "What you are saying is utterly absurd." "You don't have to believe me," Lynn smiled, lifting his tea again. He seemed completely unconcerned about whether Isaac believed him. "I am merely recounting the future I saw. Whether you believe it or not is your business, not mine." Isaac instinctively frowned. He could see that Libert genuinely didn't care whether he believed him or not. It seemed Libert was indeed just informing him, nothing more. "All right, I have told you what I needed to. Isaac, if you have other official duties to attend to, please go ahead." Lynn smiled as he put down his tea. "I also need to find Mr. Bethel. I plan to explore the capital of the Balaam Empire thoroughly tonight." Having said his piece, Lynn brushed past Isaac, preparing to leave the meeting room. With his message delivered, it was time to make his exit and leave the Isaac some time to think. As for whether Isaac would believe his words, Lynn knew that he wouldn't believe him so easily. But, Lynn glanced back at the still silent Isaac, a smile tugging at his lips. A moment of doubt is all that's needed, isn't it? Oh, by the way. Standing at the meeting room door, Lynn suddenly remembered something and looked back at Isaac. "I wouldn't recommend you tell your father about what I said today. Of course, if you're looking to court death, I won't stop you." Death Consul looked at him and replied coldly, "Prince Libert, please do not sow discord between me and His Majesty. That is a very inappropriate behavior." "Hey," Lynn couldn't help but laugh. He looked up at Isaac, still smiling. "So you're not entirely unaware, huh? That your father is making you more and more like him." From the moment he saw the Death Consul, Lynn's after-effect had already told him that the god of death, Salinger, hadn't just whimsically transformed Isaac into his resurrection tool before dying. Much like the true creator did with Lennevis, the god of death, Salinger, had been deliberately modifying his most excellent offspring, Isaac, from the beginning, nudging him to become more like him, making him a more suitable vessel for his resurrection. And it seemed that Isaac wasn't entirely unaware. Perhaps out of faith, fear, or obedience to his father and deity, he chose to comply, to pretend he hadn't noticed, to act as if nothing was happening. Of course, it could also be because Isaac couldn't do anything about it. He was merely the god of death's offspring, just a sequence to Death Consul. Even though he was second only to one in the Balaam Empire, in the presence of the god of death, he was just a pawn that could be manipulated at will. But to say Isaac was entirely willing, Lynn looked at him and couldn't help but laugh. If he were truly willing, there wouldn't be a future Mr. Isaac, would there? How could someone cold and unfeeling be willing to give everything for another cold and unfeeling being? "It is my duty as his offspring to give everything for His Majesty," Death Consul Isaac replied after a brief silence. "Perhaps, but if anyone tried to make me give everything, I'd beat them until they gave everything to me. The last person who tried to attack me is now a pen, and I must say, it's quite suitable for writing stories." Lynn spoke with a gentle, harmless tone, but the content of his words was anything but. End of chapter. "Not everyone has the support of their father like you," said Isaac, the Death Consul. "No, you're mistaken. My confidence doesn't come from Mr. Bethel. But that's not important." Lynn smiled and shook his head, suddenly tossing something to Isaac. Isaac caught it, puzzled. It was a copper whistle. "This is a token that can summon my messenger. Feel free to write to me anytime, and you are welcome to seek my help," Lynn said with a smile, looking at Isaac. "If one day, you wish to escape your current situation and gain a life truly your own, you can always find me." Lynn did have a messenger. After opening his second Smurf account, he summoned a messenger while idling at the Abraham family estate. It was a swift little creature, fond of knowledge and art, who got along very well with Lynn in every sense. Isaac clutched the copper whistle tightly and remained silent. Lynn opened the door to the meeting room, and the sealing power of the room disappeared with his action. He then stepped out of the room and vanished down the corridor. Isaac stood silently in conference room number 3, holding the painting Libert gave him in his left hand and gripping the copper whistle tightly in his right hand. It might have been a few minutes, or perhaps longer, before Isaac moved. He pocketed the copper whistle and looked at the painting again, his gaze lingering on the small cat with the silk top hat for a long time. Finally, he folded the painting, pocketed it, and left the meeting room. A few minutes later, in the palace of the god of death, Death Consul knelt before the throne, his expression respectful and devout. "It seems the child of Bethel gets along well with you. What did you talk about?" The god of death, Salinger, asked indifferently, his expression cold as if he were merely making casual conversation. "Libert is very concerned about my marital status. Perhaps because he retains much of his humanity, he seems to yearn for the familial and romantic bonds of mortals," Death Consul answered respectfully. "Ha, just a cub after all," Salinger sneered, seemingly disdainful. "Additionally, Libert loves painting. He even gave me one of his works and offered to paint a portrait for me. He also gave me a way to summon his messenger," Isaac continued with a calm expression, presenting the painting and copper whistle from Lynn. "He seems to genuinely appreciate me and hopes to communicate through letters. Since he is willing to befriend you, then befriend him well. Bethel values this offspring greatly. Winning him over will help us win over Bethel," Salinger said, glancing at the items Death Consul presented. Confirming they were ordinary, he retracted his gaze and spoke indifferently. Mr. Dorr had always been someone Salinger wanted to win over. It wasn't just because Mr. Dorr was only one step away from becoming a true god, but also because of the Abraham family behind him. A family with the Dorr pathway was very useful. If he could win over Mr. Dorr and the Abraham family, Salinger would have more confidence in achieving certain goals. As for the possibility of Death Consul lying, Salinger didn't think he could be deceived. Not to mention, Salinger never imagined that his long-term tool, his resurrection vessel, who had always been respectful and devout, could be so easily swayed by someone else. Least of all, he didn't expect someone to dig at his supposedly most unshakable cornerstone upon their first meeting. Lynn's own, corruptive, nature and his uncontrollable unpredictability as an entertainer truly defied the world's norms. "Yes, Father," Death Consul bowed deeply, answering respectfully. It was as if he had never heard Lynn's shocking words, never had his future shaken or questioned, and never knew about everything Salinger had done to him. Only the deeply bowed head and the completely hidden gaze, when unintentionally falling on the copper whistle, revealed a hint of hesitation, indicating that Isaac hadn't forgotten what had just transpired. Escape the current situation and gain a life truly his own. Did you mean what you said to Isaac? Meanwhile, in the corridor of the Balaam Empire's palace, Bethel Abraham silently appeared behind Lynn, speaking hesitantly. He wasn't worried that his words would be overheard. As long as he didn't want it, no one could silently spy on this space, not even a Sequence Zero. This was Mr. Dorr's confidence as the King of Angel of the Apprentice Pathway, the highest below Sequence Zero. Ads by PubFuture. Bethel, what do you think? Do you think I was purely deceiving him, or genuinely describing his future? Lynn stopped, unsurprised, and looked at Mr. Dorr not far away, smiling. Bethel hesitated for a moment, then said, "I don't think you had a reason to deceive him." "Yes, I didn't deceive him. I did see his future, and every word I said was about what would actually happen in his destiny." Lynn smiled and nodded, nonchalantly dropping this bombshell. He then looked at Mr. Dorr and said, "So, Bethel, are you curious about your future?" Bethel Abraham froze, staring at the young man before him, recalling the battle between him and the bitch tree. Others might think this was just a young angel, might think he was Bethel's child, but only Mr. Dorr knew what kind of existence Libert truly was. In Mr. Dorr's mind, Libert had long been equated with the pillars like the Lordofthemysteries. So, faced with Libert's seemingly playful words, Bethel Abraham knew better than anyone that he could very well see people's futures. Because in his battle with the bitch tree, Libert had displayed powers related to time. So, should he ask? Should he know his future in advance? Bethel Abraham suddenly felt a rare fear, hoping for a desired outcome yet fearing Libert might describe a future he couldn't accept. But Mr. Dorr ultimately asked, "Is it a good ending?" Lynn didn't speak immediately. He stared at the middle-aged gentleman before him. After a few seconds, he made a face and said, "I was kidding. I don't know your future. Mr. Dorr was stunned, not knowing whether to feel regret or offer some form of thanks. But Bethel then saw the young man look up at the scarlet moon in the sky as if recalling something. Then Libert looked at him, beaming brightly. I promise you'll have an ending that isn't so bad. Perhaps it won't be as you wish, but you won't die at the end of your journey, nor will you lose your way home. Bethel stared blankly at Libert, and wanted to ask, do you really not know my future? But in the end, he just said, thank you. End of the chapter. On the fifth epic, September 27th, at 15 Minsk Street, Klein once again met with Mrs. Mary Gale, who had commissioned him to catch her unfaithful husband. As an efficient detective, Klein had confirmed the infidelity just one day after receiving the commission. He had also identified the mistress and pinpointed the location of their meetings, the Quelaag Club. However, since he wasn't a member of the Quelaag Club, Klein couldn't get inside to obtain concrete evidence of the affair. Fortunately, Mrs. Mary Gale was quite generous and willing to invest heavily in this matter. She offered to help Sherlock join the Quelaag Club and cover the initial membership fee, as long as he could get tangible proof of her husband's infidelity. Naturally, Klein agreed to this proposal. After sending off Mrs. Mary Gale, Klein stood at his door, his gaze almost instinctively falling on 16 Minsk Street across the road. Since Lynn had met with Mr. Isaac the previous day, Klein hadn't seen him for a day and a half. Emotionally, Klein was a bit worried, but rationally, he knew that with Lynn Soto's usual temperament, Lynn probably didn't need his comfort and would likely get through it on his own. Moreover, Klein almost instinctively recalled the events after Lynn left the previous day. After Lynn had left, and since Mr. Isaac wasn't in a hurry to go, Klein took the opportunity to ask Mr. Isaac some questions about mysticism and other things he had always been curious about. For instance, who exactly was Mr. Dorr? What was the situation with the Abraham family? Some of these questions were answered by Mr. Isaac, while others even he couldn't remember. These weren't the main points, though. The main point was that just when Klein finished his questions and was about to seize this rare opportunity to have dinner with Mr. Isaac remembered something related to Lynn. Klein vividly recalled Mr. Isaac's complex and subtle expression at that time, as well as his words. I remembered some things. Klein, your friend might be more mysterious than we imagined. Mr. Isaac had said, his eyes filled with reminiscence and his tone quite complicated. Mr. Isaac, what did you remember? The Klein in his memory had almost instinctively asked. I remembered that he had once told me about my future, Mr. Isaac sighed. He told me that my soul would no longer be whole, that it would split into two, and that I would be trapped in an endless cycle of amnesia and searching. He also told me, at this point, Mr. Isaac paused and looked at Klein, that I would meet you. Klein swore that he had been completely stunned at that moment, followed by a surge of shock and disbelief. Mr. Isaac, are you saying that Lynn predicted you would meet me? But how is that possible? Indeed, how could that be? He was a transmigrator. How could someone have predicted his existence so many years ago? Klein's mind was utterly boggled at that moment. The last time he had been this confused was when he encountered the fellow angel transmigrator. Wait, angel transmigrator. Klein suddenly felt uncertain. Given what he currently knew, the fellow angel obviously had a close relationship with Lynn Soto's and had significant knowledge about transmigration. So, was it really that impossible for Lynn Soto's to have predicted his existence in advance? As Klein thought about this, he couldn't help but look at Mr. Isaac, waiting for his response. He didn't precisely state your information. He only told me that at the end of my journey, I would meet someone who would change my fate. That person would be my student, my anchor, and would change my destined destruction, giving me a chance to choose. Mr. Isaac spoke slowly, his tone gentle. He looked at Klein with soft eyes. But my spiritual intuition tells me that you are the person he mentioned. Moreover, he also made a painting for you. Although I no longer know where that painting is, in it, there was a little black cat wearing a silk top hat that looked very much like you. Is that so? Could it be a mistake? Klein suddenly felt a bit embarrassed, wanting to laugh but also feeling it was inappropriate. But why a cat? How do I look like a cat? He probably used a metaphor. In that painting, I was also depicted as a cat, but stronger than you. Mr. Isaac explained warmly, if you saw the painting, you would understand why I think that little black cat represents you. I even suspect that Libert did know your specific information but chose not to tell me at that time. That sounds amazing. Is it really possible for someone to predict the future so precisely so many years ahead? Klein's mind immediately conjured images of various characters from novels and anime with predictive abilities. Comparing them to the Lynn Sotos he knew, Klein shook his head. I just can't imagine Lynn being all serious or filled with the aura of a seer. Despite his joking, Klein didn't forget the main issue. He then looked at Mr. Azek with concern. If Lynn's prediction is true, what about your soul, Mr. Azek? My soul indeed seems incomplete now, but I have no clue where the missing part is. Mr. Azek's expression turned a bit helpless. Upon recalling that part of his memory, he did realize that his soul had an issue. Based on his memories, he could infer that the problem likely stemmed from something his father did. But Mr. Azek couldn't remember anything about his other half of the soul. However, don't worry, there will always be a way. And according to Libert's prediction, you are the one to change my fate. Mr. Azek smiled. He didn't truly expect Klein to do anything for him, but the fact that his valued student might be the one to save him was certainly a joy. I will do my best. Although I don't know how I could change your fate, Mr. Azek, if the future allows, I will certainly help you. Klein spoke earnestly. He genuinely regarded Mr. Azek as a mentor and had received considerable help from him, so he naturally wanted to help change Mr. Azek's destined destruction. Your willingness is enough, Mr. Azek said sincerely. Regardless of whether Klein could help him in the future, he was delighted to have such a student. And please, relay this message to Libert for me. He might not want to see me right now. Okay, Mr. Azek. End of chapter. TN. I have added the missing number 98 chapter, you can go and check it out. The recollection ended here, Klein's gaze still fixed on 16 Minsk Street, feeling quite complicated. Though he suspected it might be due to fellow Angel, as a transmigrator, having his appearance predicted in advance made it impossible for Klein to ignore. I wonder if Lynn can remember something. Fellow Angel surely knows some things, but they clearly don't intend to tell me directly. Thinking of this, Klein felt somewhat helpless. At that moment, he finally saw the door, which had been closed for a day and a half, open, and a familiar figure appeared in Klein's sight. Yo, Sherlock, good afternoon. Looks like you're ready to visit the next teacher with me. The young man waved to him, looking as lively and silly as ever. Indeed, he has recovered. Klein sighed in relief and waved back to Lynn. Good afternoon, Lynn. To ask what Lynn had been doing these past 2 days, that would be a long story. Firstly, after ending his semi-idle self-isolation performance, Lynn's main account began organizing the gains from visiting teachers and compiling the collected information into a teaching manual for future student instruction. Lynn's first Smurf account was still busy handling affairs for Saucereer and selecting initial members for the Eye of Secrets. At the current pace, Lynn had already selected quite a batch of good candidates. Once the ancient sun god returned and approved the establishment of the department, Lynn could finalize the initial teaching materials and figure out the proper teaching methods to start his position directly. By the way, after studying the Abraham family's materials, Lynn found that although mid to late stage teachings might need other supplements, the initial teaching could directly use the Abraham family's universal materials with slight modifications. After all, though each pathway's specialization differs, the basics of mysticism are largely the same. Additionally, when Lynn received mysticism textbooks from the Abraham family, he also requested an introductory textbook for children from the butler. Lynn knew that the students he would teach might be older than kindergarteners, but their literacy levels were likely similar. Let's just say, among the humans Lynn brought back to the Divine Kingdom, there were some who became Beyonders for various reasons. Though their sequences were low, the literate ones could be counted on one hand. Becoming a Beyonder in this era, abundant in characteristics, was possible with luck. But to be literate, someone had to teach them, which the demonic wolf clearly wouldn't do. So when Lynn said his first task after establishing the Eye of Secrets was literacy, he wasn't joking. Apart from his main account and first Smurf account being busy, Lynn's second Smurf account had been quite leisurely these days. Not intending to get involved in the affairs between the Tudor family and the God of Death, Lynn spent his time in the Balam Empire teasing the Death Consul and strolling around the Empire with Mr. Door and Amon. During this period, Amon behaved well and didn't cause trouble, but Lynn didn't believe Amon had given up on his mischievous ways. Based on his understanding of Amon and discussions with Mr. Door, they both agreed Amon was likely preparing a big prank to reveal near the end of their Balam trip. Now, let's see who outsmarts whom. Mr. Door and I have prepared a surprise for you, little raven. Thinking this, Lynn listened to Klein recounting Isaac's newly recovered memories. Lynn wasn't surprised, listening seriously before rubbing his chin and saying, "Sounds like I was quite impressive back then." "Indeed, very impressive." Klein nodded in agreement, then couldn't help but ask, "So, did you remember anything?" "It seems I do have some impressions." Lynn showed a reminiscing expression, covering his forehead with one hand and smiling. "Actually, I gained some memories these past 2 days, just as you described." "No problem. These memories were indeed just gained, as he had just experienced all this." "Did you remember anything else? Like the prophecy?" Klein asked nervously. He was very concerned about that prophecy, not only because it involved Mr. Isaac's fate but also because it concerned him. "No, I only remembered what you described, nothing else." Lynn showed an effortful recollecting expression, "Except, I think I gave Mr. Isaac a copper whistle, one that could summon my messenger." "A copper whistle, a messenger?" Mr. Isaac didn't mention this. Did he not remember or forget? Klein was stunned but took note of it, then continued to ask, "Anything else?" "Seems like just some daily interactions with Mr. Isaac, proving we were friends, but nothing critical." Lynn shook his head, then showed a subtle expression, as if wanting to say something but hesitating. "Is there something inconvenient to say?" Klein saw Lynn's expression and knew he might have remembered something critical but was hesitating to tell him. "It's not inconvenient, it's just that I think I might have tried to poach Mr. Isaac from the God of Death." Lynn laughed awkwardly, scratching his head. "In my memories, I seem to be trying to recruit Mr. Isaac from the God of Death." Klein. This. Though it wasn't the information he most wanted, Klein still couldn't help but give Lynn a second look. Poaching from the God of Death. Lynn's courage was impressive. Makes sense though, with Mr. Door backing him, and Lynn clearly wasn't simple himself. "Anything else?" Klein continued to ask. "No." Lynn honestly shook his head. Before his second Smurf account caused more trouble, he indeed had no such memories. "But," Lynn looked at Klein seriously, "though I don't know the prophecy, I am certain the little black cat in it is you. If you want, I can even recreate that painting." Klein. "Why a little black cat?" Klein didn't understand, but he still nodded honestly, "Please do." He was very curious about the painting that supposedly predicted his and Mr. Isaac's connection 1,000 years ago. End of chapter. Lynn's painting skills were indisputable, especially since this time he was only copying one of his former works, making it practically effortless. So, after just a dozen minutes, Klein saw the cat painting that Isaac described, which supposedly predicted his existence thousands of years ago. "It really looks this much like me." Klein looked at the painting in his hand, his gaze falling on the black kitten wearing a silk top hat. He picked up a mirror from the table and looked at himself, momentarily silent. Klein finally understood why Mr. Isaac was so certain when he said that as soon as Klein saw this painting, he would realize that it depicted him. The little black cat in the picture looked remarkably like Klein. Despite the very fairy tale style of the painting, the delicate hat, the scholarly air, and those amber eyes looking at the larger cat protecting it, anyone familiar with Klein could immediately tell the cat was meant to represent him. "No wonder it looks like me. After all, I painted it based on your image," Lynn thought to himself but outwardly nodded in agreement. "Indeed, it looks very much like you. That's why I confirmed it was you when I remembered this painting." "So, the student who could change Mr. Isaac's fate mentioned in the prophecy is really referring to me. Someone really predicted my existence thousands of years ago." Although Klein had already believed this before, confirming it again made him feel complex. Klein then looked up at Lynn, who, after finishing the painting, was sipping coffee, occasionally taking a sip. Sensing Klein's gaze, Lynn gave him a bright smile. "I think there's no need to get hung up on this. Prophecies, in general, are not that different from divination. As a seer, don't you often predict your own future?" Lynn sipped his coffee and tried to comfort Klein. Lynn did admit he had a bit of fun stressing Klein out when hinting about the prophecy to Isaac. After all, giving the fool some sense of urgency was necessary to motivate him to advance. "Ah, I am truly considerate. The Evernight Goddess should let me have the best catkeeper title," Lynn shamelessly thought, then continued, "Regardless of the prophecy, I am here in front of you, aren't I? So rather than worrying about that, let's prepare to visit the next teacher. Yes, the prophet himself is right in front of me, and he's lost his memory." Klein suddenly realized something and looked at Lynn with a peculiar expression. "So, if you could foresee Mr. Isaac's future and predict my existence 1,000 years later, did you foresee your own future? How did a prophet end up in this state? Or is it all part of the plans made by the past Lynn?" Klein felt puzzled. "I don't know, but maybe I did." Lynn took another sip of coffee. "I suspect that everything happening now was set up by my past self. Perhaps the person who contacted me did so because of some deal with the past me." Klein nodded in agreement. He had similar suspicions. "But that doesn't matter. Once I recover my memory, everything will become clear. By then, I might be able to answer your questions too," Lynn said, suddenly patting Klein's shoulder forcefully. "So, detective, join me in finding my lost memories. After all, you're somewhat involved." Klein couldn't help but laugh but still said, "Is this a commission?" "You could say that. Yes, it's a long-term commission." Lynn nodded and after a pause, added, "As for the commission fee, I can waive the crafting fees for any scrolls you need, though you'll still have to cover material costs." "Then I accept this commission." Klein nodded. He was curious about Lynn's past, even if he hadn't been commissioned. After all, in a sense, this concerned Klein himself too. Since Lynn had foreseen his existence, did he foresee other things too? What kind of deal did the Angel of Secrets have with the past Lynn, and how did it relate to Klein's transmigration and the gray fog? Klein exhaled. He had many questions, and his intuition told him that he might get the answers once Lynn recovered his memories. But even so, how should we start searching for your past? Klein rubbed his temples thoughtfully and said, "The only known clues are Mr. Dorr and the Abraham family. Perhaps we can find something about your past from them. Let's not consider Mr. Dorr. As far as I know, he was exiled from the world at the end of the fourth epoch. It's more reliable to start with the Abraham family," Lynn eagerly suggested. Although he hadn't really lost his memory, he was curious if the Abraham family had records about him. Moreover, observing the Abraham family would help him understand how his past actions affected the present. If Isaac was a great subject to observe individual influences, then the Abraham family was perfect for observing group influences, helping Lynn understand the indirect impacts of his changes on the current era. The Abraham family has long declined, and without any clues, finding one of them is like looking for a needle in a haystack, Klein sighed. "Looks like we'll have to take it slow and hope for some good luck. I think it's manageable. If I'm truly Mr. Dorr's child, he might have arranged everything. So meeting an Abraham family member might just be a matter of time," Lynn said optimistically, not planning to guide anything actively, just waiting for fate to bring it to him. Meanwhile, he could leave more traces in the fourth epoch's Abraham family, increasing the chances of being recorded. End of chapter. It is indeed possible, Klein agreed, nodding his head. He suddenly had a complicated expression as he thought of something. If Lynn is really Mr. Dorr's child, how would he perceive his father being banished and his family's decline? Would he feel any sorrow or regret? Don't look at me like that. Theoretically, I should feel sad, but I've recovered so few memories that I can hardly relate to my past self, Lynn abruptly said, causing Klein to pause and almost instinctively wonder if he had accidentally spoken his thoughts aloud. "Of course, your eyes are clear enough to tell me what you're thinking," Lynn replied, placing his coffee down and showing a hesitant expression before saying, "Moreover, although everyone says Mr. Dorr is my father, and I haven't recovered those memories, something feels off." Lynn was obviously preparing for the future when his Libert Abraham alias would be exposed, allowing him to assume the identity of the Angel of Secrets. What does this mean? Could there be some hidden truth that Lynn isn't Mr. Dorr's child? Klein was instantly intrigued, but Lynn clearly didn't intend to delve further into the topic. Instead, he stood up and said, "Let's not dwell on things we can't figure out. Let's handle the immediate tasks first." Memories will come back when they're meant to. Detective, in a way, you are really, Klein couldn't help but chuckle. However, as Lynn mentioned, they couldn't find any clues about Lynn's past for now. It was better to focus on their current tasks. Thus, the two detectives equipped themselves again and resumed their school visits to interview the teachers Lynn had already scheduled. This time, however, the process went smoothly without any hiccups. What's going on? Did Klein's trouble magnet trait stop working? Or can it only activate once in a short period? Walking home, Lynn ate his ice cream and glanced at Klein, silently wondering. What's up? Is there something wrong? Feeling Lynn's gaze, Klein, also eating ice cream, turned his head and asked in confusion. Nothing. Lynn shook his head but suddenly sensed something, stopping in his tracks and looking in a specific direction. The next second, Lynn frowned and said, now there is. There's something, a demonic aura. Others might not sense it, but Lynn's perception was stronger than many angels, and he clearly felt the presence of the Abyss Pathway's aura in that direction. Just moments ago, Lynn doubted Klein's trouble magnet trait. Now he was rethinking, how could I doubt Klein's trouble magnet trait? Here comes the trouble again. Demon. Does he mean a Beyander of the criminal pathway? Unlike Lynn, Klein was instantly alarmed. Out of instinct as a Nighthawk, he quickly asked, can you pinpoint the location? If it were Beyonders of other pathways, it wouldn't matter as much, but those from the criminal pathway were invariably corrupt and murderous. Every official Beyander would eliminate them without hesitation. Roughly, yes. Should we go? It might be dangerous. Lynn tilted his head and asked Klein. Let's go. Klein hesitated for less than half a second before nodding firmly. If it were other wild Beyonders, it wouldn't be an issue, but criminal pathway Beyonders were deadly. As a Nighthawk, he had to investigate, even if it meant danger. And with creeping hunger, I might still stand a chance, Klein thought, watching as Lynn grabbed his arm and took out a small scroll, murmuring something. The scroll exploded, covering them in pale light. Ads by PubFuture. Psychological invisibility. Having ordered a batch of these scrolls before, Klein recognized Lynn's tactic immediately. Great. Now they could observe and strike at the right moment. Klein felt more confident, preparing to use creeping hunger. Lynn led them through an alley, and soon, they heard a woman scream. They came upon a scene where, in an empty street, a woman in a bright dress sat helplessly on the ground, terrified and screaming. Opposite her was a large black dog with sharp, white teeth and red-stained fangs, growling menacingly. Its eyes were cold and cruel, with a hint of mockery. Clearly, the dog could kill the woman instantly but chose to prolong her despair. Klein exchanged a glance with Lynn. No words were needed. They separated and took their positions. Lynn readied his scrolls while Klein raised creeping hunger. His left hand glowed brightly, turning golden. Klein leaned back, arms spread wide as if to praise the sun. A beam of pure, scorching light descended from above. This was a Sun Pathway Sequence 5 ability, effective against demons. But in the next moment, Klein's pupils contracted. The giant black dog sensed the attack and dodged. Not only that, but it also grew rapidly, becoming a 2 to 3 meter tall monster. A pair of large bat wings unfolded from its back, and mysterious patterns appeared on its goat-like horns. End of chapter.